On a 24,900 mile circumference ball-shaped Earth, over a certain number of miles, there should be a given amount of curvature. And that's something that's testable, you know? Not some ancient cult Masonic conspiracy theory. True, true. Flat Earthers be losing peeps on that conspiracy tip. That's true. Just because something may be true doesn't make it catchy. That's why we test, talk results, and speak scientifically. Like this guy named Samuel Rowbotham, who came out with an equation for how to calculate the curvature back in the 1800s, and it stood the test of time and correlates to the equation as listed on the Horizon entry of Wikipedia. But here's the curveball. If the Earth is flat like a disk, think of it like, say, a CD-ROM with the North Pole in the middle, then there is no curvature, as there would be on a sphere. If there's no curve, having an equation for how to calculate that curvature is moot. What are we even calculating for? Yeah, but if there is one, then it can be subject to calculate for this curve. As far as I can tell, Samuel Rowbotham's math holds up, but I've never seen it used in a scientific journal or on a university website. If you find something, let me know. My point is that although that may be an accurate equation for the curve of a sphere with a 25,000 mile circumference, the popular narrative has already shifted away from this. It appears discussing an agreed upon measure for the curve might require a different approach. Whatever did you have in mind? Well, I recently found a back door into a curvature measurement. This guy named Joshua Nowicki took an alleged photo of Chicago from almost 60 miles out across Lake Michigan in Stevensville, and it made a news cycle. This photo was crisp, beautiful, and shouldn't have been viewable on a ball Earth. ABC57.com, April 28, 2015, reports, and I quote, "Under normal conditions, even when extremely clear, this should not be visible, due to the curvature of the Earth." So what did they say it was? A superior mirage. The meteorologist actually said, "Typically, we would not be able to see this," and added, "This image would be viewable from much, much higher, up in the sky, up in space." But the main point to me wasn't, is it a mirage or not? What I gathered was a report that at nearly 60 miles away, the Earth's curvature blocks Chicago's skyline. Why is that interesting? Well, they wrote in that article that they typically should not be able to see this Chicago skyline because it's below the curve. So we can take the altitude of the skyline and deduce objects of that height or less can't be seen from distances of approximately 60 miles. What it gives us is a minimum amount of curvature as declared through the popular narrative. So other shit that's 60 miles away, if it is below the height of the Chicago skyline, shouldn't be viewable? Exactly. So I Googled the biggest building in Chicago, and the biggest one is Willis Tower, formerly Sears Tower, coming in at 1,450 feet. Then I pinned the exact distance between Stevensville, where Joshua Nowicki was, and Chicago as the crow flies, and it came in at 57 miles. So we can say for effing positive that in the northern hemisphere, objects 1,450 feet or smaller shouldn't be observable from distances of 57 miles or greater. In other words, shit that's 60 miles out should hide anything smaller than 1,450 feet. Now, interestingly, Rowbotham's equation for curvature for a distance of 57 miles comes in at 2,166 feet, not too far off. If we include his research, the curvature at 57 miles lies in between 1,450 feet and 2,166 feet. But I'm inclined to stick with the smaller measurement, to be positive we're aligning with the mainstream narrative around the curvature of the Earth, and not as some flat earther from the 1800s tells us. Or even, for that matter, a Wikipedia entry on Horizon. But as ABC57.com meteorologist Tom Coons tells us, to me that's the reality, that we're up against. And by the way, I'm sure Tom's a nice guy. This is in no way a personal attack. I'm simply observing the popular narrative that's been handed from higher to lower degrees of influence. What else do you know about the purported curve? Well, the curve increases proportionally to the distance you travel. That's why Rowbotham figured the distance in miles squared. But as far as the mainstream narrative is concerned, which doesn't seem to want to vet Rowbotham, I can say for certain at 57 miles, objects with a height of 1,450 feet or less shouldn't be seen. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, it gives us a reference point that isn't an avid flat earther from the 1800s or the Horizon Wikipedia article, neither of which would gain much traction in a boardroom of stiff-coated naysayers. However, with the ABC story, we can say, according to a meteorologist at abc57.com, over a distance of almost 60 miles, objects at a height of the Chicago city skyline or less shouldn't be observable. And then we can transpose that fact onto other parts of the Earth. Yeah, but we're told the Earth is an oblate spheroid, and it's a little fatter below the equator. So, the amount of curve looking west from Stevensville toward Chicago would be different than the amount of curve, say, looking south from Quito, the capital of Ecuador, which lies on the equator. That's a great point, Ted, and I agree. I will address it in a two-pronged manner. First prong, if the pear-shaped oblate spheroid model is correct, then we can only transpose the Lake Michigan anomaly onto locations to be very rigorous at or above the same latitude. To be slightly more inclusive, also throughout the northern hemisphere, because we're told the Earth doesn't get fatter until below the equator. If we are indeed pear-shaped and our belly bulges below the equator, the curve on the fatter part of the Earth would be less pronounced. But this still locks in everything north of the equator as having, for a distance of 57 miles, an effect of making things 1,450 feet or shorter disappear. I know this is a little heady, but we get to display these apt mental gymnastics to undergird that our rational mechanism is highly functional, and neither grandiosity nor subjectivity, which we enjoy, distort our processing power. In order to keep up with the Joneses, we've got to grok the learning curve that is currently being sold. So basically you're saying if we're a pear and we're fat below the belt, and the belt is the equator, then the curve is less pronounced the farther south you go below the equator. And thus we can only transpose the supposed curve across Lake Michigan to locations of a similarly shaped part of the Earth, namely the northern hemisphere, because, according to the popular narrative, the Earth is slightly bigger below the equator. Precisely. Which brings me to the second prong of this point. The reason we are told the Earth gets fatter below the equator is because it generates math similar to the azimuthal equidistant model. They've updated the model to an oblate spheroid to make sense of certain circumnavigational discrepancies as they become more widely known. For example, the pear-shaped Earth allows for significantly differing circumnavigational distances at equal or opposite degrees of northern and southern latitude. That's why it has been updated. On a pear-shaped Earth, the distance around the Tropic of Cancer in the northern hemisphere would be considerably shorter than the distance around the Tropic of Capricorn in the southern hemisphere. On an azimuthal equidistant model, that is, on a flat disk model, the explanation is far more elegant. It's a circle, and just like expanding concentric rings from a pebble tossed in a pond, the farther out from the center of the circle you go, the greater the circumnavigational distance about it, headed due east or west. Makes sense, but like you said, the math will work whichever model we select. So how can we truly know? Only by disproving the narrative as billed to us. In this instance, we can observe the ABC article and go observe something over 60 miles away. And if it is shorter than the Chicago skyline, such as the shores of Oahu, you'll have successfully kiboshed the popular curvature narrative. If you want to give yourself some more leadway for shorter distances, use Rowbotham's 8 inches times the distance in miles squared. So how did this guy Rowbotham test for the curve? Samuel Rowbotham was one of the first great truthers, notorious for making mincemeat of scientists whom were arrogant enough to debate him without reading his research. Fortunately for us, his work can still be built on. For example, he did one of the first, I suspect there isn't a curvature experiment, what he called the Bedford Level experiment. The Bedford Level is a man-cut, straight drainage canal that stretches 6 miles across. Rowbotham stuck a telescope 8 inches off the water on one end and had a buddy hop in a boat with a 5-foot mast and row to the other side. On a 24,900 mile circumference ball Earth, over a distance of 6 miles, there should be 24 feet of curve, minus the 5-foot mass and the telescope 8 inches above the water. The boat should have disappeared below just 18 feet of the round ball Earth. But Rowbotham watched that mast in clear sight, plain as day, as his buddy rowed all the way to the other end of the canal, 6 miles across. In a flat world, that makes perfect sense. On a ball, oblate or no, his sight should have been obstructed, just like this dude Nowicki with the photo of Chicago. Right, and you said it was done in England. Yeah, in Norfolk, UK at 51 degrees latitude. So even higher north. Exactly, but there wasn't even a little bit of blockage. Now I think 6 miles is a rather pithy distance, and granted, this was over a century ago. But it's the formula that is of interest. Others today are making new observations. Such as who? David Wolf spoke at a flat earth panel at Lightning in a Bottle this year and went off on some knowledge. Oh yeah? What'd he drop? So he said the thing that broke it down for him was observations that shouldn't be able to be made on a 25,000-mile circumference ball Earth. Such as? Similar scenario to the Chicago skyline or Norfolk, but Wolf lives on Kauai and was looking out at the mountains of Oahu, nearly 70 miles away. And where is Kauai located? 22 degrees latitude. So still north of the bulge of the equator. Right, so we can still assume a degree of curve similar to that as ABC claimed. Plus, 70 miles is considerably more than 57, so there should be at least the Chicago skyline worth of curve. That's it. And before I say it, what's cool about that is we know David Wolf. At least our friends do. He's in the community. I've met David Wolf. Right. So there's a certain amount of trust there. People look to him to give good information on juicing, superfoods, and the like, and he's always demonstrated that he's done his research. I'm inclined to agree. So David says when he's on the shores of Kauai, he can look across the oceans to the tops of the mountains of Oahu. But those mountains, such as Mount Kaala, are over 4,000 feet tall. That'd be easy to see with the curve. That's right. Slow down. According to ABC's definition of the effect of Chicago disappearing at a distance of 60 miles, you should only be able to see the upper half of those mountains from Kauai. But David Wolf says that that doesn't happen. He says on a clear day you can see to the tops of the mountains and then follow with your eyes all the way down the mountains to the coast. He says you can see the coast. You definitely shouldn't be able to see the coast at that distance. But if you trust David Wolf, we can. So go do your own research. And now we have a rule of thumb. So long as David Wolf's observation is accurate, and I especially encourage others who live on Kauai to attempt to make the same observation, we're confronted with the difficulty of adjusting a new worldview. That all we can really say on the matter is, and I quote Mr. Wolf, is that as far as we know, it's optically flat. That's something you have to deal with, and that's how you fly it too. Anything beyond optically flat, we have to figure out for ourselves. I like that. As far as we know, it is optically flat. It is guarded, We are always learning more about our reality. Being scientific is being open-minded yet reserved, curious yet measured. I agree. I think it's high time we should use our eyes to conduct an experiment. That's the spirit. It's called Zeteticism. It means to proceed by inquiry. That's what I plan to do. So we should be out there doing these experiments, and if it's a good experiment and it works, then other people can replicate it, and if they rigorously maintain the same methods, then we have evidence of repeatability, the cornerstone of any nutritious scientific method. Data.